we have been thinking quite a lot about energy prices and about transition and about energy taxes in the past years. And always when we looked into it, the big question was that essentially there's so many different possibilities to optimize your system of energy taxation that we wanted to. It's on at the moment. Okay. Yeah, but I don't. It's not working.
Mine is working.
So does it work now? Yeah. Okay. Okay. So we as I've looked into it, and what I saw is that we have a way to optimize taxes, for example, as a based on a polluter's pay principle. So in order to change the behavior of people, so the ETS is one of the cases in point. We might want to raise taxes where they reduce distortions. So in order to, for example, reduce the cost on labor, so that more people get employed. We want to follow distributive consequences of taxation, so to make sure that the taxes are progressive and not regressive, which some people claim is not the case for emission permit trading. We have in Europe, as an energy importer, quite an interest to have relatively high prices on energy consumption, because that might improve our terms of trade, because the exporters are then able to not fully exercise their market power, but leave some of the money on the table for our fiscal authorities. We use some of the taxation to finance the usage of completely different things like road usage, infrastructure. We use taxation in order to boost competitiveness in some sectors. So we try to sometimes give tax credits for certain sectors where we think they help us in our long-term competitivity. We give tax breaks for social purposes. So there's a whole bunch of maybe 10, 15 different rationales for optimizing your tax system. And all this builds on a legacy tax system that already exists. Now, that's incredibly complex, and a whole strand of the economic profession is dealing with that. And on top of that, now we come here and discuss all this in the framework of the energy transition. And that's now going to get even more complex, because in the energy transition, we will have a whole lot of dynamics that will come on top of what I have just told you. So we might see a decentralization, so own consumption, people going off-grid, not paying taxes anymore because they consume directly what they produce. We see decarbonisation, and which might mean that energy consumption in some sectors will go down, and with this tax revenues, like so who is going to finance the roads if there's no more mineral oil taxes revenues? We have the issue of convergence, so we have the same fuel being used for different usages and falling under different tax rates, and we have the different fuels used for the same usage. So electricity being used in transport and heating. So this makes up for a very complex, probably one-year research program, and actually, I'm very happy to have Karen Pittel here, because Karen is one of the lead authors, together with Herman and Ian and others, on a book on energy taxation that they just published, and Karen will try to boil those questions down in 15 minutes.
So it's working now. Let me just start. Yes, now I can start. I'd rather stand up. I'm going to say something about fiscal aspects of energy taxation of the EU ETS, but I'm not going to cover the entire fiscal spectrum of instruments that has fiscal kind of implications. So I'm not going to talk about subsidies. I'm not going to talk about R&D, public expenditure for R&D, etc. So perhaps that comes up in the discussion, but I'm going to focus mainly on energy taxes and on the EU. And as I was told, EU ETS, and as I was told that I should rather not spend 20 minutes, but now it's 15, I'm probably going to skip some of my slides entirely, which you probably know anyway. So my plan was actually to give you some background on not really fiscal stuff, but basically on emission trends in the EU ETS and the non-EU ETS sectors. But I think this is something I can do very shortly or skip entirely. Then I'm coming to the fiscal aspects related to the EU ETS and the non-EU ETS fuel and heating taxes, etc. And I'm going to finish with some key messages which can also be interpreted as input for the following discussion. So basically, this just shows you as kind of like getting into the mood the development of EU 28 emissions, and you see basically since the introduction of the EU ETS in 2005, you see this kind of decline, especially in the EU and EU ETS, EU energy emissions. But on the other hand, if you take a closer look at the different shares of fuels in the EU, then you actually see that in some, with respect to the usage of some of the fuels, not much has changed since the introduction. So if you take 2005 again, you see that basically with respect to coal, there's not much change in the percentage share of energy consumption in the EU. With respect to transport, there is a slight decrease. That's obviously not EU ETS related. And with respect to gas, you see a slight increase, but the biggest change has actually been in the pickup of renewables, and that is obviously also to a large extent not due to energy taxation, but more to also support of renewables in different types and in different forms in the different countries. Just one short slide on the development of the EU ETS and the non-EU ETS emissions. You see that basically this is starting with 2005. There is kind of the parallel trend, so that's yellow and blue, that's the actual emissions, and with red you see the cap, EU ETS cap, and you see basically this phenomenon that has many people bothered during the last years, that we have an excess supply of certificates, and for that reason then also a dropping price. Yesterday I looked it up, it was like 7.44 per ton of carbon dioxide, and that's of course way below what's usually the estimates for damages caused by a ton of CO2. Now this kind of only gives the overview over all of the EU, but if you take a closer look, of course, at the instruments that are actually used, and there we kind of come to the fiscal elements, in the different member states, you actually see that the picture is quite heterogeneous. So it's not only heterogeneous with respect to the CO2 intensities or with respect to renewables, share and mix in the different countries, but it's also very different with respect to the CO2 prices. And in CO2 prices, you of course have to include all types of different taxes, also, for example, feed-in tariffs that are actually used to promote renewables over fossil fuels. So taking all of that together, in our book, Edenhofer et al. Come to the following pictures just for 4 countries, and basically just for CO2 prices from electricity, transport, pulp, paper, and cement sectors. They take the OECD sectoral emission prices and then weigh them by the emission shares and come to these implicit CO2 prices, and you see basically Germany is pretty high here, but that also includes the feed-in tariffs that are paid on the electricity. So that's one of the reasons why it is quite high. Of course, that paints a completely different picture than what like normal economic theory, standard economic theory would like, having the same CO2 price over all sectors and over all countries. So we have already seeing here that not only for fiscal reasons, but for also other political economy reasons, we have very different CO2 prices in the different countries. Coming more directly to the fiscal aspects, let's take a look at the government revenues that are actually raised with EU, with energy taxes and allowances in the EU. Now, if you look at the EU ETS, basically we had about 5 billion raised from the auctioning of certificates in 2015. Now that might seem as a relatively large number at first, but of course if you then compare it to the revenues raised from environmental taxation, not only energy, but environmental taxation in general, that we will see is far exceeding this. And why is that so little? Of course, there's basically two reasons. On the one hand, not all emission certificates are auctioned off, so it's still less than 50%. Always keeping in back of your mind that about 40–45% of all greenhouse gases in the EU are covered by the EU ETS. And the second reason is, of course, the relatively low prices. You see here, basically what I just said, this is 15, but basically we're all about the same level right now. So it was at about 5 and increased since August to now about 7.5. And of course, if you had higher certificates prices, you would have also higher fiscal revenues. Now, this is one of the consequences that the much discussed EU ETS price floor would have on the fiscal side. It would raise more revenue for governments, but on the other hand, which is of course more discussed, is the incentives for clean innovation, for innovation in clean technologies. That one fears at this price level is just not going to be there, especially if the expectation is that it's actually going to remain at such a low level for quite some while, which many people expect despite the market stability reserve. So in the short run, introducing a floor price, 20, 25, whatever euros per ton of carbon, would of course stabilize expectations with respect to price. It would stabilize income for the government, but on the other hand, it would reduce the flexibility that comes with the ETS to react to economic shocks, etc., which was one of the desired aspects actually of introducing also an EU ETS. So there's always pros and cons, and one alternative might, for example, be a more discretionary or even rule-bound mechanism with which you could buy certificates off the market, retire them, thereby reducing the emissions overall and also raising the price. There could be initiatives of single countries, but there could also be coalitions of the willing, like France, Germany, and potentially other countries. So that is basically the EU ETS situation. Now, if you look at environmental taxes, like I said, the EU ETS revenues is about 1 to 2% of the revenue that is raised by environmental taxes. That includes also pollution taxes, that includes motor fuel taxes that are not only raised for CO2 reasons. But nevertheless, that's quite a share of government revenues, whereby most of this is actually raised through energy taxes. But you see also that there is a whole lot of heterogeneity between the different countries with respect to the share that these revenues have for the government budget, also with respect to the composition of the of the income from these taxes. So blue is from energy, yellow from motor vehicles, and red from others. And you see basically the dominance of the energy taxes, but then also the quite large chunk that's coming from motor fuel taxation. Now, this is basically across countries with respect to the revenue side, but if you look at the taxes themselves, at the tax rate, there's also a whole lot of heterogeneity going on. Now, looking, for example, at household electricity taxation first. That would be for a number of EU countries, not all of them, the picture that we have here. And you see basically that there is Denmark with almost 400 euro per ton of CO2, and then going down to the UK and to the Czech Republic with almost no energy taxes or even subsidies with respect to electricity household use. Now, of course, that is very hard to interpret because electricity is an output. It's not an input. So basically, it doesn't tell you anything really about how intensive the electricity mix is that is used in the different countries. I mean, you see that basically Denmark has a very high tax on CO2, could be an incentive to reduce the carbon intensity of electricity. Now, for Denmark, that might not really be the issue. For other countries, that might be more of the issue. The problem is really that you do not tax the input, so the coal, the gas, the oil, or the renewables that go into the electricity mix, such that actually this burden is adjusting to changes in the CO2 intensity. But this is independent of the CO2 intensity. For example, in Germany, it's just an energy tax on electricity. And then on top of that, which is not even in here, is the feed-in tariffs that are financed by charges on electricity. So both of that is actually increasing the electricity price. Then also having other consequences that, for example, in Germany are very much discussed at the moment by raising electricity prices, but having very low, relatively low, taxes on household gas and household light fuel oil, as you see here, for the case of Germany. You, of course, also distort the incentives to potentially move away from fossil fuel use in heating, in transport, and back from away from fossil fuels towards electricity. Electricity is not that green so far. I mean, about 30% of electricity in Germany is provided by renewable sources, but it is getting greener and greener over time. So incentives to actually switch to electricity and less carbon-intensive fuels in heating and in transport also need then a correct depiction of the CO2 intensity. So if electricity were getting greener, that would mean that this would go down, and it becomes more attractive to actually switch also to sector coupling, as it's usually labeled. But without this CO2-related taxation, this output taxation, you don't have these incentives. So you kind of skew away, you make your life harder in the sense that you do, by pushing renewables into the market, have a greener electricity, but that electricity is then not picked up and used in other sectors as much as it would be economically efficient. But you also see here pretty well that between the different fuels that we have here and electricity, there's quite the difference. This is just households. Then with respect to transport, you see that most of the countries actually have higher or relatively higher taxes on the use of petrol and diesel, and you see also that diesel in most countries actually tax less than petrol. And then you also have in red now the industry, where in most countries the tax rates for industry are lower due to competition reasons. I mean, this picture is very heterogeneous. Now, there is, of course, attempts to actually get it more homogeneous, so basically using some tax minima that the EU defines for in the energy tax directive, using tax minima on the different fuel uses of motor fuels and of heating fuels. You see, those are also quite different. There's not really systematic. I mean, there was a proposal for a revision of this of a new tax system in a sense, keeping gasoline at the same level, but then basically taking that as the benchmark and then systematically also changing the tax rates on the other fuels. So basically for each fuel that was supposed to be contained 20 euros per ton of carbon, which is at kind of the lower end of the estimates that you get for damages. And then another component, which is the energy related, so volume related taxation. And you see that for on-road motor fuels, that is way higher than for the heating fuels, and off-road motor fuels, also taking into account for congestion, for accidents, for also other local emissions that come with the use of on-road motor fuels. So that would mean actually that you have a more systematic approach to this taxation, but this initiative was actually not did not go through, but was cancelled in 2015. Now, basically, just to show you how important the different fuels are that are actually covered by the energy tax directive, you see that basically most of the coal, this is ETS fuels, most of the coal is not even covered by it. So that's not really such a big deal with respect to coal. But of course, most of the fuels, gasoline, diesel, kerosene that you actually use for on-road transport, etc., is covered by the energy tax directive. Now, looking at the actual prices, at the actual tax rate, you see this is the minimum that is defined by the directive, And here you see basically the tax rate of in the different countries. This is for gasoline. And you also see the social costs associated with local pollution, congestion, accident, and carbon that are actually caused by the use of gasoline in the different countries. That is very heterogeneous. So it makes sense to some extent to have heterogeneity in the tax rate. So it's not that every country should actually have exactly the same tax rate, because many of those components are actually local. They're not EU-wide, so they're having one EU-wide tax rate to internalize different local effects is also not efficient. But you see that with respect to some countries, you actually have tax rate lower than the social cost would be. With respect to some, you're actually way above that. And the same basically holds for diesel. If you look at it, this is the old minimum tax rate. This would have been the new one with the new proposal. And you see some countries at least would have to move up. Now, with respect to coal is basically mostly, like I said, covered by the EU ETS, so the tax directive doesn't make much of a difference. And most countries don't even have local coal taxes. Just showing you this to show you how strong the difference between different countries with respect to the social damage, social cost can actually be, depending, of course, the type of technology actually you use in, for example, electricity production from coal. EU ETS at current prices covers about 30% of these costs. So, of course, some countries it might be more, some countries it's actually less. Now, just giving you an idea of different possible ways to have a reform of the energy tax directive and of the possible effects. I'm going to give you an overview of what Ian and Herman actually did in our book. They came up with 4 different scenarios for reform, 4 basic scenarios, and then 2 variants of each. So the first one would be the proposed, what I just explained to you, the proposed reform. The second one would be if you had an additional CO2 charge on ETS fuels, value of 20 euros per ton of carbon, in addition to the EU ETS price. Then just coal tax, actually of the value of 28, so kind of taking into account that that you're just kind of focusing on one energy carrier here of 28 euros per ton of carbon plus the EU ETS price. And then you have an additional tax or higher tax on motor fuels. And you see that basically the strongest effect, this is the percentage reduction in CO2 emissions, comes from also including the ETS fuels, which is not very surprising at the current price. This, of course, comes with a caveat, a quite substantial caveat. Because if you actually have an additional price on the ETS fuels, that basically means a crowding out of the emissions from these fuels towards other emissions that are covered by the EU ETS. So that would mean a drop in prices of the EU ETS, and then, of course, less incentives to produce clean or cleaner in other sectors. Now, this was basically calculated under the assumption that you, along with these reforms, also have some mechanism in place that reduces the number of allowances in order to keep the EU ETS price stable, and then you have quite substantial CO2 reduction effects. But if you don't do that, then you have this offset, and that basically is limited when the EU ETS price hits 0. So then you might actually get some additional emission reductions. If you still have a positive price, have some types of interior solution, you would have a complete offset. With respect to the revenue gains, since we are also talking about fiscal aspects, you see that basically the same pattern that we have with respect to emission reduction also holds here. With respect to health effects, we have a little bit more differentiated picture. And that basically comes from the second differentiation that I haven't introduced so far. And that's the differentiation between kind of the normal reform, where every country does the same, and a 2-speed reform, where you actually take account of the fact that there are some countries that are more resistant to reform than other countries. So in this case, Ian and Herman took those countries that have less than 15,000 euros per capita income per year, and basically calculated the effects if those countries just had to increase their energy taxes by half of what the others did. So kind of raising the potential for more willingness to participate, to actually get these types of reforms through the EU, to get them accepted. And you see that actually the difference is, this is always, everybody does the same, two-speed. Everybody does the same, two-speed. So the effects are not that strong, neither with respect to the budgetary effects, nor with respect to the CO2 emissions. So that might actually be a way to get more participation, more support for these types of reforms that you need if you want to actually deal with European energy taxes. With respect to the health effects, like I said, it's a little bit different because these countries that they kind of excluded from the full increase in the tax have just 90% of CO2 emissions, but have more than half of the local emissions. So if they reduce less of the local emissions, then that has health effects, that has premature death effects. And so this picture is more diverse. I've just refrained from showing it. So one last slide I actually have with respect to content. And that is just showing you what would happen if we had unilateral policies like that, where you actually try to increase the price for CO2 within the EU ETS covered sectors on a country basis. And the country of choice in this case was Germany. What you can expect is, of course, the same type of mechanism that we just discussed. So if there is just the increase in the price and there's no offset with respect to the number of emissions, you have compensation in the other sectors. So you don't reduce emissions by much. If you just have like one country, for example, a coal price or a CO2 price in Germany or coal exit in Germany, then that would actually, without any compensatory mechanisms to the number of allowances, lead probably to more or less complete compensation of emissions increases somewhere else in the EU ETS. That might be limited with respect to the market stability reserve. If you actually hit or increase the excess supply, then you would have to put less or take more out of the market, thereby stabilizing the price a little bit, and thereby also getting some EU ETS reductions on top of what you usually had, if you don't put them back into the system later. I mean, that's of course then the prerequisite. But of course, if you kind of like drive at that effect, you basically undermine the mechanism that is the EU ETS. So basically by driving it down to a situation where you have to constantly adjust the number of certificates, that's basically getting you very close to a CO2 tax. So if you want to rely on that mechanism, you might actually change the system, if that's possible. Now, if you actually, what you could of course do is at least put in the CO2 price all over the EU, but perhaps differentiate it a little bit. And that's actually the situation that we have here. That is basically a situation where we have a CO2 tax in Germany for the EU ETS fuels of 20 euros. But we only have kind of this same type of CO2 tax or price floor in the rest of the EU that is either 5, 10, or 15 euros. So that's below what we have in the one country. And what you see is actually here the change in annual emissions in Germany, in the rest of Europe, and all across Europe. And you basically see like the whole range of outcomes that you get for like 5, 10, and 15 euros for the rest of Europe. And you see that basically the higher the EU, if you just have like 5 in the rest of the EU, then that's of course leading to the least emission reduction, because there's lots of possibility for the price of the EU ETS to decrease and for the certificate to be absorbed in other sectors. If you have 15, that's pretty close to the 20, so you get overall a more substantial emission reduction. But what you also see, I mean, the same is mirrored basically here in the electricity production in Germany. So you have a decline in the electricity production. You have more electricity production in other sectors, but overall in other countries, but overall it almost remains the same. So this kind of leakage effect, if you want, is of course the stronger, the higher the price differential between the two zones, regional zones. I mean, if you have a price of 15 in the rest of the EU, you would get additional economic cost of what they calculated in their paper, 30, if you have 15, you would get an additional cost of like 12 billion euros. If you had a price of 5, you would get an additional cost of 36. So that's quite some additional costs that actually this type of measure comes with. So this is basically also in warning for national measures that are not taken into account when you deal with the number of allowances. I mean, it could also, of course, then accompany if you have, for example, the coal exit in Germany, like it is often proposed, you could at the same time take the number of certificates out of the market that are actually saved by having the coal exit, so not coal emissions anymore from these plants in Germany. But I mean, that doesn't really make sense either, because then you could also just reduce the number of certificates, but leave it open where actually the emission reduction takes place. So best is to kind of be carbon neutral or technology neutral, and then have emission reduction by reducing the number of certificates. So all of what I kind of presented here as a little teaser for the discussion is actually from the book, just a little bit of advertisement that was mentioned in the beginning. What you find in there is actually much more of what I just presented, but we also have more on, for example, R&D. We have more on also on social cohesion, on fairness, on distributional effects, for example. So there's a number of different issues addressed in the book. I think it gives a quite nice overview of aspects that are on the policy agenda at the moment. And to just put the key messages that I kind of implicitly already mentioned. The first one is actually the question on how to stabilize the carbon price, and kind of a vote for having not a floor price of carbon, but rather a mechanism that works via open market interventions. The second one, the inefficiency of having national initiatives unaccompanied, like coal exit plans, as we have them, for example, in Germany, but also in other countries at the moment. So they basically, in putting it quite harsh, they don't have an effect on emissions, and they are, for that, more or less a waste, in my opinion, of taxpayers' money. Then, basically, a call for switching from output-based taxation, so for example, electricity taxation, towards more input-based, so CO2-related taxation, that then also has a positive effect, for example, on the sector coupling that we need in the long run in order to not only reduce emissions from the electricity sector, but also from transport and heat. And finally, in order to be able to get reforms of the CO2 pricing, a two-speed system might be something to consider. The losses with respect to CO2 emission reduction and the losses with respect to revenue are not that strong as we have seen, but it might actually raise the willingness to participate in these types of reforms quite substantially. So thank you very much. I can leave this on, but I think you have some slides as well. Yeah, okay.
Many thanks, Karen. So I give it to just Ulrike.
For carbon taxes, for emissions trading. And in fact, we have a full decade of policy development on carbon taxes. And then we discovered there was no way it would materialize because of the unanimity provision. And so we switched through carbon markets, and that's how the ETS was born. But all elements that were raised by Karen appeared in the debate. We were digging them out one after the other. And every time we resolved one issue, another issue was that the EU, the Treaty of Rome, is not having a chapter on taxation. And as it has not a chapter on taxation, we have to adopt anything we are doing there with unanimity. And unanimity, at the time when we tried this, we were with 12 member states. Today we are with 28, 27, and the EU has become more diverse. And in particular, when we see the slides on energy taxation, it is the Central and Eastern Europeans who come from an era where they were subsidized in their energy consumption. They had to switch for a taxation system on fuels, for example. And so that is a very important change to take into consideration. Now, the other important comment that Georg was saying in the beginning is we can go for any pricing systems, but they are now they take place in a given institutional and regulatory environment. So whenever you come with something new, something exists already, and that is the additional difficulty we are having. Now on the ETS, it was said by Karen, it's 11,000 energy-intensive installations over the EU. But the most important that I was not putting on the slide is that they are subject to exactly the same market conditions. So it is an internal market perspective. So it is a market that is creating the same conditions for an installation, whether it is in Sweden or in the south of Spain or the east of Europe. It doesn't work. So does it now work? Yes. Okay. So we have a system, an ETS, that is completely internal market. So it doesn't matter where your installation is based, it is subject to the same price signal. That means, according to economists, the marginal cost of abatement is being equalized. And that is highly efficient to reduce emissions. Which begs me the question, listening to Karen's intervention, what do we want to do? Do we want to reduce emissions, or do we want to raise revenue? And I think that is a very different question. Because if you are bothered about raising revenue, you may lose out of sight that you have an efficient system to reduce your emissions. And that is what the ETS is doing. And it is so far the biggest market in the world, but not for long. Because as we speak, the Chinese are passing legislation. And by 2020, the Chinese system is going to be roughly twice as big as the European system. So that's why we are not only very present in the Chinese debate, but we also started the debate about cooperation between all those who have carbon markets in the world. So we have a good established debate with California, with Canada, with New Zealand, with Korea as well. That's one of the connotations. But when I heard the double system, we have such a variety of players, should we not have a double system that is specific for lower income member states? We don't like that. Because it would undermine the efficiency of the system, the cost efficiency for reducing emissions. In fact, if you have your target, you don't bother where the emissions are being cut, as long as it is at the lowest cost. But if you are poorer, you cannot afford that much. And that is where we have three very important redistribution mechanisms inside the ETS that are hardly debated any longer, but 10% of the auctioning rights are being redistributed to the benefit of lower income member states. And I can tell you that some of those member states, like Poland or Bulgaria or Romania, who have a lot of coal, they do know that on top of the auctioning rights that they get attributed, that they on top of that, they get 10% of the others redistributed. Another element is that under the famous Article 10C, for those who have particular problems, they can give free allowances to the power sector. Again, the price signal, the marginal cost of abatement, is left untouched. But there is a kind of allowance that is being given for free on certain conditions, and that is a very important one for lower income countries. And on top of that, we have a modernization fund that is now taking away money from the richer member states and channels them to the poorer member states. So there are a number of redistribution mechanisms that is quite significant in money terms in order to increase the solidarity of the system while maintaining the overall efficiency of the system. Now, a cap and trade system has at least one benefit, that is that the cap is being delivered. So when we look at the cap is going down. Historical emissions is the dotted line. We had an increased scope, so that's why the line is going up. But basically, we have a continued decrease of emissions, and it's going to decrease up until 2030. In fact, it's quite spectacular because in 2030, we will have 43% lower than 2005 emissions. So in less than, or say in 25 years, we will have a reduction of 43%. And that is delivered through the cap setting. That is the most important element of a cap and trade system. The compliance rate today is 99.7%. We have a few gaps on compliance because of aviation, where there are here and there small aircraft operators that we still have to chase. But 99.7% is absolutely fantastic if I compare it to whatever environmental regulation we ever enforced in whatever member state or in whatever as we have on our table in the European Union. So compliance is good, the cap is being delivered, and the cap is being delivered at lowest cost. So you could ask yourself the question, why do we bother? And of course we bother because we know that the prices have gone down from something around 25 euros to something 5 euros today. So there is a problem because the price incentivizes innovations and investments, and encourages the alternatives. That's why I said I wanted to put forward a provocative question, that the cap is being delivered at a low price. Normally an economist would say, hooray. But as prices are low, these also incentivizes alternative investment. And so we have had a price debate. And what we were doing in Europe is that we created a market stability reserve. I mean, the overhang between supply and demand. And this market stability reserve is going to have a doubled increase of the intake in the reserve as of 2019. So we are, by way of speaking, in the most difficult part of the curve, of the price curve, because what we were suffering from, and we have not been trumpeting that too widely because we are always very nice to the United Nations, but what is behind the curve and the supply and demand is the import of CDM credits that we had. And the CDM credits that we generously imported from the Kyoto Protocol system almost equal the overhang between supply and demand. So we didn't want to be negative on the UN, but we have to put into perspective that the cap under the Kyoto regime was increased by the CDM credits instead of decreased. And so the amount of credits was significant, and we should keep that in the back of our mind. But never mind, what we are now seeing is that now that we are finalizing the legislation up to 2030, the prices have, over the last couple of months, raised quite significantly from below 5 to 7+. And I think that this price increase is going to continue because the legislator has made a number of key important decisions on the functioning of the market stability reserve. And the overhang is going to be eaten up in 1, 2, 3 years from now. And we will see, I think, a return, I will not say to previous price levels, but to price levels that is going to be way beyond the 10 euros. So the market stability reserve is going to function in an accelerated manner as of 2019, and that should allow a balance where the cap is being delivered at the lowest cost possible, and at the same time with a price that is encouraging alternatives. Now back to the tax debate. As Karen was saying, there are revenues from auctioning, and the revenues were around 5 billion in 2015. It's now, of course, if the price is higher, we have higher auctioning revenues. So if the price would be double compared to the price we had in 2015, we would talk about 10 billion. So if we would have a price around 15, 20 euro, we are going to talk about ranges that are substantially in terms of revenues. Now, we asked the member state to spend the revenue for climate action to compensate for this loss of incentive for alternative investment. And we also are setting aside an innovation fund that is today, according to the finalization of the negotiations, around 450 million allowances. If you add up the modernization fund and the innovation fund, we come close to 1 billion of allowances that we set aside in a fund to encourage investment in alternative investment in the energy sector. So perhaps not the big amounts like we saw on the energy taxation, but the energy taxation goes to the global pot of money that governments are collecting, while this is dedicated money that we could channel to emission reductions. Back to the Energy Taxation Directive that Karen was developing at large. We have not lost our faith on carbon taxes at all. But what we do under the ETS, we do that for the competitive sector, that is major installations who have to compete on world markets. While the small emitters, they are subject to the Energy Taxation Directive. You and me, when we buy services in our households, when we are a transport user, etc., etc. So for the Energy Taxation Directive, the emissions outside the ETS, there is a scope for taxation, obviously. We tried it in the EU. We made a proposal in 2011. We said, supposedly, if we would pay 20 euros per ton, which is on average the price we were seeing up till now on the carbon market, and it went to be a bit undiplomatic nowhere. So the Commission withdrew its proposal in 2015 because every time there was an incentive that could have been created through the Energy Tax Directive review, an incentive to reduce emissions, immediately there was a draft of exemptions that were added to it. So we were dragged down in an endless list of exemptions for sector X in location Y, etc., that we lost completely the oversight. So it was a cheese with big holes. And so we thought withdrawing was probably better and give it another try, but there should be a bit of coherence in this, what we try to achieve. So we have not lost our faith, but we lost our faith, when we saw how the Energy Taxation Directive was discussed in the institutions. We have another example that went much better, which is the Eurovignette, that is for road haulage, that we now reviewed, and it is a tax that is according to distance. And distance is the shortcut for emissions. So it's no longer buying a vignette, and there you are okay, but it's according to distance that you pay. And we can build in a significant reward for environmentally friendly vehicles. So if you buy a lorry, and it is having the latest technology standard, then you can have a quite significant reduction on the Eurovignette payments that you are making throughout Europe. And so the systems that you see, the electronic tolling systems, are being harmonized, put up, and we have a system that is a little bit, more orderly compared to the many different systems we have in the past. Now, coming back to the fact that we did not lose our faith that carbon pricing also can be done through taxation. You are familiar with the Monti report, because in the EU, there is always the debate about the finance and the way how we are going to use our finance in the future. But now we have a big member state leaving. There's going to be a big hole in the budget. And so what is coming on the table of the policymakers is, are we going to cut down the expenditure of the EU with roughly 10-15% because one major member state is leaving? Or are we going to raise revenue through another source? And that is what the Monti report is asking itself. And so resources in the field of energy and climate were brought to the table. And there are several ones. There are the ETS revenues, the revenues from auctioning. As I mentioned, it could easily be between 10 and 20 billion if
the prices are higher than what they are today, and the hope is, the trust is that that is going to happen in 1-2 years from now. Or you can have a carbon tax, a CO2 tax, the addition on the energy taxation, like we tried in the past, but on one condition, that we are not concentrating the political debate on the wholes, but on the substance. And I think that needs to be well prepared, and that's why I welcome this discussion here, because if you go for an energy taxation, and the whole debate is about how you can have exemptions to escape the energy taxation, you miss the point. The motor fuel levy was also mentioned. An electricity tax was also mentioned. So for those interested in the debate, the Monti report is a very good analytical document that is on the table of the Commission. And so we said in our reflection paper on the future of the EU finances that carbon pricing as a revenue to support policy objectives is a way to go, without specifying which kind of precise carbon pricing that is going to be on the table of the policymakers later on. Also, President Macron made a speech on which he said we need a sufficiently high carbon price, and that's very well understood. But there is one proviso. If you dictate a price, then you need a policy to define the price level. And for all those who have followed the debates on the ETS, I think that's going to be very challenging to agree on a price. You can rather agree on a cap and see what the price is, and the prices are now being low, but they may be higher in the future, but it's everybody's guess what the price is going to be. But if politicians have to decide on a price, what is too high for one is always too low for the other one. So I think that is a very complicated thing that I'm not particularly volunteering in having to have that debate organized, because it may create all kinds of discussions that are leading us or leaving us far away from what our objective is, and that is reducing carbon emissions at the lowest cost. That is the starting point. And so a sufficiently high carbon price may serve the purpose, but is immediately going to trigger the debate about competitiveness. And so border measures are immediately quoted in the same context. A high minimum price and border measures. So there may be a voluntary discussion taking shape between Germany, some Benelux countries, etc. But still, that question, you cannot have a border measure inside the EU, because the EU is about breaking down borders and not erecting borders. And so we have to be very clear about what we are going to do here. So the policy challenges related to that are trade policy questions. And that is all the time looming on the table. You know, even under the Paris Agreement, one is leaving the Paris Agreement, the United States, and it triggered the debate, we should have perhaps a border measure to punish the ones that are willing to leave the Paris Agreement. All nice and well. But if we look at the other side, the Chinese are inside the Paris Agreement. The Chinese are taking action, while most of the worries related to trade come from that source and not particularly from the challenges we have with the United States. So trade policy questions are very complicated, and the WTO has an Article 20, but has hardly used Article 20 so far. So also, if we would go into that debate, it needs to be properly prepared. And the other policy challenge is, of course, unanimity and tax questions. That is, very difficult. If you would go for a minimum price or a dual price or whatever price, you fall into the trap of taxation. And taxation is unanimity. And in the EU, agreeing on unanimity is a very difficult subject. So that is the only thing I wanted to say. You know, we have an active website. We have also a book where we explain our policies, and we are reviewing that book. But I'm not here to make publicity. I'm here to open up the questions. Let's not undermine or let's not value too low what we have compared to a big dream that may come one day, but that will politically be a very long process to make it happen. Thank you.
Gregor Pett is working at Uniper, a company that is active in most European countries and in most energy-related areas. So would be interesting to get your company perspective a bit on differentiation of taxation.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity. I mean, very important points, almost all the important points have been made in the previous presentations. Let me add to those from a practical perspective, from a company operating in these markets. First of all, if I leave aside for a moment the state finance aspect of the taxation, then I would say the most important aspect here is to drive change in the behavior of companies and of individual people in there. So the question is, when we assess our policies, how successful are we in doing that? If I look towards the end customer, I think realistically taxes in the, let's say, in the Western Europe, I think there's limited impact on taxes, on the behaviors of people, as we've seen, for example, in the case of electromobility or gas mobility. So, for example, if we look at the pure aspect of climate and of tax, yeah, so gas mobility should be far more advanced than what we are seeing currently. So obviously there's another aspect which is also there, which has to be overcome over time. Which means then, if we look towards the end customer, the reliability of the policies and the stability of the direction, I think, is very important, because people, we must not lose people on our way towards what we're doing. So, in other words, if it was purely for climate protection, we should also look at the other aspects, like in this case gas mobility for the heavy load vehicles, for example, even more important than for the individual passenger vehicles. So we should sometimes look more pragmatically, and I'm picking up on this word from your interventions here, so more pragmatically towards the issues at hand, and look at this less in an ideological way, like we want to have it all carbon-free by 2050. There's a long way going out to 2050. So we should, on the way there, see that we make a progress in the right direction. And I think sometimes there are more pragmatic ways out there than to look for the, let's say, final wishful target picture further out. So that would be one reflection. The other reflection, if I look towards the taxation of CO2 in particular, I think the ETS to a certain extent is a success story, because it's a European market. It works, technically works very well. On the other hand, of course, it doesn't drive the behavioral change which we want to see. So if we want to continue to develop that system, we must make sure that we reach the target, the environmental target, but also we drive the behavioral change. So in this is a very delicate aspect. So Karen has shown this very interesting picture, not interesting, that's in British sense, I mean really in the German sense, interesting picture. It's a very good picture, which basically shows the entire message, yeah, of what happens if you single-handedly impose a carbon tax in an individual country. So that it simply doesn't work. Yeah, so what happens, and we've done the same calculations, obviously, so what happens if you impose a carbon floor in Germany? By the way, so I mean, you are aware that the government is being developed as we speak, so people are looking for coalitions. So it might not be impossible that together with France, these ideas come on the table. But what will happen? Yeah? What will happen is that the energy which is no longer produced then in Germany, because coal production is more expensive than in this case, and some coal plant might even be forced then to be phased out, that will be picked up by, well, let's say French nuclear plants, if these plants are available. So that is also a question, because they need investment and financing as well, and coal plants in other parts of Europe. So if we go for a two-speed approach, that might very easily backfire on the climate target side, as we see from that slide. It simply doesn't work. It's less than half the effect which you want to achieve. But you also create distortions from a competitive point of view, and at the end of the day also distortions in the corporate landscape. And probably what is the worst of all is you undermine the trust people have in the policies. If you undermine the trust people have in policies, you undermine investment, and which leads to procrastination. So people simply don't invest because they wait. What happens next? Oh, we've seen surprises, so we wait for the next surprises before we invest. That will never happen. This is the worst we can have in Europe. If you look at the system, and the system goes through a big transition, the system needs investment. The system needs investment in climate-friendly technology. That it's not necessarily only renewables, but also, for example, gas, which can play a role in this as a transition fuel. So again, I'm not looking into 2050, but rather 2030 and how we reach our targets there. We need reliable policies in there. And a multi-speed approach can easily jeopardize the trust people have in the system. It can undermine investment, and it can at the same time also backfire regarding reaching our targets. So I would really ask for some caution in all these approaches, and it might not do the trick at the end of the day. The approach which is currently being pursued, like modernizing or adjusting the ETS, is a very much a good approach, I think, and we all share the common goal that the ETS at the end of the day should drive investment, should drive behavior. We need prices much beyond the level of 7, which is, by the way, in recent history, a record even, the 7.5 here. Hooray, hooray. So, and we even see some fuel switch at the moment, but that's more because of the expensive coal price and not of the ETS. But we need to bring it there so that it drives behavior, and reaching our climate targets and reaching it in an efficient way with hopefully all the technology incentives we can find there. So this would be my way forward.
And I think that was a clear message from industry and very well understandable. I find it interesting that you see a relatively limited sensitivity to taxes. I think that's something we might want to discuss. And maybe afterwards I also give the floor to Jonathan on one example we have with differentiated carbon prices with the carbon price support in the UK and the experience there. But before that, I would like to give the floor to Ian Perry from the International Monetary Fund from Washington to get some outside view on this European discussions.
Yeah, I mean, at the IMF, we think that getting energy prices right, reflecting not only production costs but also the environmental costs in fossil fuel prices, has to be the centerpiece of both climate and energy policy. And when I say environmental costs, I have in mind not only the climate costs, phasing in prices that are broadly in line with mitigation commitments, but also broader environmental costs like air pollution, coal combustion, traffic congestion in the case of transportation fuels. And there are two key reasons why we think getting energy prices right should be the centerpiece. First is that this is the most environmentally effective approach. For example, a broad-based carbon price is going to provide across-the-board incentives for reducing energy use and shifting to cleaner fuels across all sectors of the economy with one instrument. And in addition, we think that the fiscal aspects are very important. If countries were to phase in the sorts of carbon prices that would be consistent with their Paris pledges, so perhaps for a lot of countries, something in the order of about 60 euros per tonne by 2030. More for some countries like Australia, Canada, somewhat less for China, India, emerging market economies. But so 60 euros per tonne is going to be raising substantial amounts of revenue, maybe 1-2% of GDP, a lot more than that in a country like South Africa, which has a high coal intensity. So I think it's very important that when you're raising such huge amounts of revenue, that most of that revenue is used productively, most obviously to lower the burden of taxes on labour and capital. Or in emerging market economies, maybe they can't raise sufficient revenue for basic public services because from broader fiscal instruments, because they have such large informal sectors. So maybe carbon taxation in emerging market economies creates an opportunity to create very valuable revenues for funding badly needed investments in infrastructure and education to enhance growth. So that's our general perspective, that countries should be moving towards getting energy prices right for both environmental and fiscal reasons. In the European context, I guess I'd like to raise this issue of the possibility of reinforcing the trading system with a carbon price floor, because I would have thought that was important. I mean, at the moment, a 5-7 euro per tonne carbon price is really not doing much to cut emissions. Maybe it's cutting them by 1 or 2%. Or in other words, if you scrapped the trading system, emissions would only rise by 1 or 2%. Partly you have low prices because you have all these other policies, energy efficiency regulations, subsidies for renewables and so on. So if you were to scale those back, then the allowance price would rise substantially. But we do hear all the time from people in business and finance that a robust and predictable emissions price is critical for mobilizing investments in clean technology investments. So that's two reasons why I think the idea of a price floor may help to reinforce and make the idea is to make the trading system work better, make it more effective. And then a third point is that the trading system at the moment is not compatible with other instruments. For example, when the United Kingdom imposes its variable tax on top of the EU system, such that the emissions price in the UK meets a floor price, it's higher than the ETS price, but has no environmental benefit whatsoever because emissions at the EU level are fixed by the cap, whereas all it does is reduce the allowance price at the EU level. Whereas if instead the trading system underpinning it was a binding price floor, then all these other measures, if Britain wanted to go ahead and impose this carbon price, that would then have an effect on emissions at the EU level. Any other country wants to do more domestically, in addition to what's been done at the EU level, because they feel they have green preferences or whatever, those policies will be compatible because they will reduce emissions without reducing the allowance price. So I think for those three reasons, it does make sense to consider the possibility of reinforcing the trading system with a price floor. So we have in mind an auction reserve price, maybe rising, 3-4 euros per tonne of CO2 each year to progressively bring it up to 60 euros per tonne by 2030. I just think for the reasons I've outlined, that would help to reinforce the trading system and make it work better.
Thanks, Ian. I would like to do the following. I'd like to give the floor back to Karen for one reflection, and then give it to Joss, and then give it to you.
Okay, just short remarks. I mean, being an economist, I'm of course for the first best solution. I mean, that would be great if we had. I mean, my dream is kind of like having an EU ETS that covers all emission, all sectors, and the entirety of Europe. That would also lead to less fluctuations, having a bigger market. It would also be possible to kind of fix the amount of allowances in order to get higher prices. Wouldn't have distortions anymore. That'd be great. I just have the feeling it's not going to happen. So then the next point is, if I don't get my first best, what am I doing then? And then I'm basically going towards some political economy considerations and thinking what would be the second best that I actually get. And that is where basically also the two-speed system that I talked about came in. So it was not about the EU ETS as it is. I mean, there are some compensation mechanisms, although there's also an interesting article in the book that tries to come up with numbers that would actually lead to an efficient distribution of the burden that comes with the EU ETS, and argues that so far the compensation is by far not large enough. So that's also an interesting piece actually in the book. But Herman's and Ian's case was about changing from the baseline. So the baseline with respect to the energy tax directive, et cetera, remains the same, but then it's the question, how do you get support for doing more? And that was where the two-speed system came in. And of course it comes with some additional economic burden. It deviates from the first best, but since it is for countries who don't have so much emissions yet, could change, the additional cost has to be compared to what happens if I don't do the reform. So that, I think, is the important issue here. And it also, I mean, looking back, for example, at the Montreal Protocol could be interesting in that context, although it's a completely different issue. There was a two-speed system with respect to industrialized countries and developing countries, and that was probably one of the reasons why it was actually implemented quite fast. And something like that could also be in the back of the mind. So basically having a two-speed system that is not forever, but it's temporary, to get actually other countries on board. And I think that would be interesting. That wouldn't undermine policy trust, because it's a rule-bound modification of the current system. I think what's undermining trust if there's continuously changes. I mean, that's the biggest problem. And that is also, I guess, the problem that many of these national initiatives with respect to taxation, subsidies, whatever, are creating by changing continuously over time and thereby eroding the trust in CO2 prices. And I think that would be an issue that's much more important for that than the two-speed system. So perhaps I'll leave it at that.
I would add one question on top of that. You mentioned the balance between raising revenues and reducing emissions. And more political question, is it within the Commission, does everybody have the same opinion what the right balance between the two targets is?
To be very precise on your last question, no, not really. I mean, the debate has not yet been taking place, because the revenues now all go to the member states. And the Monti report makes the proposal that these revenues could possibly go to the European budget or whatever. But that's a long debate. As I said, it's a reflection paper. We said that's an important avenue, but it's not yet on the table. So we are not yet there. But what I wanted to say on the comments that Ian and Karen were making is that to not lose out of sight the importance of price expectations. Because the spot price is one thing, but if everybody believes that the expectation of the price is going to be higher, then it's everybody's guess what the price is going to be. But companies have good weapons, to build into their strategies a price expectation. They have to do that also on the coal price, the gas price, the oil price. Why not on the carbon price? So on the predictability and stability, I agree. We should not interfere too much on them into the market. But at the same time, I mean, companies have weapons. The market is having institutions who deal with price variability. And the price expectations, in my view, are firmly high for the future. How high? That's a debate. But I see that shadow pricing is being used in major companies around 40 euros per ton. Okay, that may be another thing. Now, another comment I wanted to have is we all agree that the white market is attractive, because a white market lowers the marginal cost of abatement. But what we are basically arguing here is whether in the ETS we have the power sector and we have the manufacturing industry sector. And a lot of the carbon pricing and the minimum prices are made out of reasoning belonging to the power sector. But we have the same market, and so the manufacturing sector may run into trouble. And that is what we saw with the UK on their price floor. it was okay to move out the coal mining stations, etc., or the coal-fired power stations, but the UK got a lot of flack from the steel sector because there was a differentiated price for carbon in the UK compared to the rest of Europe. And so the trade argument comes up squarely. If you say 60 euro per ton, you will have a trade debate. Who of your trading partners is having comparable prices incorporated in energy-intensive products? We talk about commodities, steel, chemicals, pulp and paper, cement. That's what we are talking about, and that is going to come squarely on the table when we would have carbon prices up to 60 euros or higher, because that matters into the final product that for which there is a worldwide, a global competition. Yeah? So we have to prepare for that. And that is where the border measures debate comes in, on which I see limited appetite today to go into border measures. Because we have a tradition of free trade, we are gradually adapting our trade policy. We have now the screening, of our trade policies. We are going to continue in bilateral agreements, but we are at the same time we are going to screen what is the environmental content of these trade agreements, and that's a new avenue for which we need to be well prepared, because we can hardly compare today trade with the US and trade with China when we would have a carbon market or a carbon price of 60 euros. I think that is quite a complicated debate. With what kind of products do we trade? What kind of commodities do we trade with the United States compared to, say, China? Just to confront the two cases.
Good. I would now like to open the floor. I see one question there.
But is there any objective, let's say, reality as to the benefits versus the issues of actually having different member states introducing a floor pricing for ETS? That's the first question. The second one is a more, let's say, general, and is as to the future of the ETS as we know it. So we, as a market, believe that the ETS is really the success story of the European Union. We have a market-based climate action tool. However, there are a number of issues, such as the relevance of the price for our European, let's say, companies. The idea that you could actually undermine the relevance of the overall system because of national initiatives. So we spoke with a number of stakeholders in the last months, and in particular also within the European Commission. The message is that the view that the ETS is not a success story is very spread, let's say. So just a very general question to the whole panel. How do you see the future of the ETS? That's very relevant for us as the market, basically. Thanks.
I would like to widen the scope beyond the ETS with one additional question from my side, if I may, which is Karen presented at the beginning the differentiated taxes for different fuels and different consumer groups, and we discussed at the beginning that with decarbonisation, and the energy transition in the title, a lot of things might change. Will the Commission essentially let the member states first go in to try how to adapt to this new reality, or is there any kind of guidelines going to be put in place to avoid too much divergence?
Well, what we should have a look at is to the functioning of the market stability reserve, because the market stability reserve is in fact a price floor, but without a price. It acts through the quantities. And if there is a surplus on the market, the question is not asked whether that surplus comes from energy efficiency, from changed economic growth, from more renewables. You know, you can have a raft of possibilities why the surplus is existing. What is in the legislation is that there is a numerical calculation of how big the reserve is. And if a certain trigger has been reached, allowances go to the reserve. So it is, in fact, a kind of price floor, but we have to give it 2-3 years to make it work, because the legislator, unfortunately, perhaps, has decided that this starts operating out of 2019. So we are not yet in 2019, so the market stability reserve is not yet functioning. But for all those who are interested, look at the small print about how it is functioning and how the current debates in the trilogue discussion are taking place. That means that we are going to see in the coming 2-3 years a significant change in the price formation on the carbon market.
Understood. If you look into the forward markets, you see it's still sub 10 euros.
Well, it's not for me to make a price expectation. That's not my task. But I'm only saying, look at how the market stability reserve is functioning. It is not yet functioning. It's going to kick in with a double intake rate compared to what was decided before. And in our expectation, it's going to have a significant impact. But important for the question that was raised, other elements of energy policy, can also change. Renewable policy, the prices on the renewables, etc. But it doesn't matter where the surplus originates. That's the most important thing. It could be a decline in economic growth. It could be the change in market shares for commodities, whatever. If there is a surplus, the surplus is eaten up through an objective trigger that is foreseeable, that is predictable. It is in the legislation, and nobody is going to play around with it. Yeah.
So probably to add to that, I mean, I fully agree. There's a huge difference between a mechanism like the MSR, where you have transparency. It's a legislative process. It's very clear what will be there. It's a open and transparent process where these things are determined. And something like, and let's use this example, the carbon floor in the UK, where it's every year in November, the Chancellor of the Exchequer basically decides what shape or form that will have. I mean, that doesn't create these investment signals. The ETS, and I fully agree, all these price assumptions go up, and if you look at all the consultants, what they project, there's a wide range, and this is good. I mean, there's a wide range between consultants like IHS or Chach, what they predict where it will be, and that's very good. That's a sign of a functioning market, that people make different assumptions on what it will be, and then they can bet their money accordingly. But if everybody plays around with a floor, that will twist the system, and we must be aware that due to the efforts of the EX, for example, and others, we have a connected system. Yeah, so the prices react immediately. It's nothing like a negotiation over time. You adjust what power plants you build and whether you invest in which country. That's not the case. The plants are there, and if you introduce a price floor, let's say in the Netherlands today, because it's being discussed there, it will immediately reach to those coal plants in the Netherlands being dispatched less, and coal plants, probably less efficient coal plants in other surrounding countries, will dispatch more. So it's the contrary of what you want to achieve from a climate perspective, simply because one country is not happy with the overall progress. And Germany, the same. So in Germany, we've played around with a renewable system, and I know that with the nuclear phase out, and the surrounding countries also did not like that. It shows you what happens if individually, without proper alignment to the overall goal and processes, you play around with parts of the system. It's not efficient at the end of the day.
3 questions.
if you put Jos Delbecq in front, what happens usually becomes a bilateral with Jos, but we try to avoid that if we can. My name is Andre Marco. I'm with the International Center for Trade and Sustainable Development. So I'm not the WTO part of that center. I'm the climate change part, but I have colleagues, and I learned a bit by osmosis. So you refer to Article 20, but you also refer to trade measure at some point. And I was just curious, just as to when do you anticipate these things will start really biting? We had all kind of meetings and discussions, and we realized that at 5-7 euros a ton is not dramatic, and nobody gets very excited. But at some point, somebody's going to get excited. So when do you see that kind of starting to kick in and becoming more of a WTO issue? Right now, it's kind of sitting between UNFCCC and WTO. That's one issue. The second issue is a little bit more delicate to ask, and you know, there's a gap in revenue in the EU, and we're trying to tax resources more than people, and we're going to that general direction. But we're having this thought that the price of carbon is going to be 30 euros, and I've been in this business now with Jos to some degree for about 20 years, and we keep hearing that the price of carbon is going to be 30 euros. Now, what you started by saying, Georg, is that the forward curve shows you that the current price was 5.5 or 6 a few weeks ago, but the 2025 price on ICE, not on EX, but on ICE was 5.7 or 6. So that tells you that either somebody's not doing their homework and doing the arbitrage, or the money people don't believe this, and I used to work for Mercuria, they really don't believe the price. They don't believe the forecast. They don't believe the modelers. Why? Because of the unpredictability of the policy intervention in the future. And I make no judgment on that. My question is different, is that we have been putting and saying that the ETS drive, the ETS drive, the ETS drive. California has always made the case that ETS is an important component. It's an important component, but it's one component. And we have created an enormous stress on ourselves to some degree by making the ETS really like kind of the silver bullet, while California is being saying, well, listen, we have all these measures and the ETS is playing a role. Is it not about time maybe to reevaluate and be realistic about what the ETS can do? That is one in the stack. It's one in the stack, but it's not the only one. And business decisions are not being made on one condition. When you go on a senior management committee in an electricity company, you look at security of supply, you look at system stability, you look at many, many things, native people, I don't know, whatever we're doing in Canada. So that was my question. Should we kind of be more realistic? I'll do your job.
Thank you very much. So, Mireille Martini from Finance Watch. So, I would like to ask a question because last summer I was associated to the work of the Stern-Stiglitz Commission, which recommended to set the carbon price between $50 and $80 a ton in 2020 and 80 to 100 in 2030. So this figure is a global figure, of course. It's a kind of a world average, and the report was, of course, basing itself on the urgency of tackling climate change, given the fact that we are already probably at 1.95 degrees of heating. So it's quite clear we are going to be above 2 degrees, and the more time passes, the more we are in a very dangerous zone as far as climate is concerned. So the Stern-Stiglitz report was also insisting that the carbon pricing really needs to shift the energy consumption and the energy modes to the energy transition, as you explained quite well. And it was insisting that it needs to go with accompanying policies. And this is my question to the whole panel, and maybe particularly to you and to the EU people involved. Do we have policies in mind in order to accompany the reconversion, the massive reconversion of the energy-intensive industries in the EU? Like, if this is stepping up, as you said, chemical industry, steel, cement are going to be very massively harmed. And I have the feeling that the resistance that there is to the carbon pricing might be connected to the fact that we are talking about pricing carbon, but we are not maybe talking enough of the possible policies to reconvert the industries. And that's my question.
That's a question in the last row, that was in the first row. Short question, please.
Very short. Stasinopoulos, formerly with the European Commission. I think we're discussing fiscal aspects, but I think George Delbecq mentioned at the end the question of trade. What's the potential impact of energy transition on trade and foreign policy? Let's take the case of nuclear energy. Does the rushed exit of Germany from nuclear has any potential impact on, for example, boosting the US coal industry or boosting the Russian, let's say, gas industry?
Okay, Kirsten start.
Yeah, I'm not sure all the questions, but yeah, I mean, there's something that I wanted to actually say before, but it quite fits now as well. Just with respect to the question of a price floor and the market stability reserve, I mean, one thing that always comes to my mind is also that, I mean, of course, people like to have a specific number what a price would be. I mean, everybody likes that in almost all markets. I mean, not knowing what the price will be is always an uncertainty. And how do I spend my income? What do I have to expect? What do I have to expect in production? Only with respect to most markets, we know from experience what the price will be. Now, with the market stability reserve, we just don't know yet. I mean, there is some uncertainty tied to it. I mean, we have the same situation we had in Germany when we switched from a feed-in tariff to the auctioning system for renewables. There was much resistance because suddenly the price was not safe anymore. It was not certain. And I think to some extent the switch to the market stability reserve and all the can we trust that, can we not trust that is due to the fact that we don't have the experience yet on what kind of impact it will have on prices. So to some extent, I'm more optimistic that we will be in a different place when we discuss the same thing in 5 years' time. 5 years? Yeah, 5 years makes sense. Yeah, basically that was just on that. Also with respect to the functioning of the ETS, I mean, I always have the feeling that there's two things. On the one hand, the ETS functions very well. Its goal is to reduce carbon emissions by 43%. And it will reach that, no matter what. I mean, the question is about short-term incentives that we create with that, but the system in itself is very well functioning. The question is, in the short term, do we have enough incentives to actually get investment in R&D? And then the question is also, how long is the time horizon that companies actually look at? I mean, perhaps you have a different idea, but talking to many people from companies, they tell me like 5 or 6 years. So the 20-year horizon is not that interesting for them. The short term is really what matters. And there I also have, at the moment at least, the feeling that many companies do not expect carbon prices to rise substantially in that short amount of time.
I'm always surprised how short-term fixed all markets are behaving compared to what we were taught when we were a student. I mean, we were taught about the rationality of markets, about price expectations, etc. And if you look at the stock exchange, not only on the carbon market, but it's all very immediate. It's the next quarter at maximum. And so the longer time perspective is hardly incorporated. And, you know, that's just an intellectual observation. But it applies to the debate we are having here. Now, a couple of comments on the question, when does the WTO question is going to come up? Well, the system we followed in Europe is that for energy-intensive activities, there is a generous system of free allocation. So again, the market price signal is not touched, but you can get your allowances according to rational criteria, benchmarks, etc. And you don't get them just for free, but once you fulfill a number of conditions, you get them for free. And so I think that a lot of companies have a strategic reserve of allowances, so they will survive for the coming 5 to 10 years, whatever the price is. But nevertheless, the price is going to act as an instrument on that market, and they may value their reserves at a higher rate. And second, I think that our system of free allocation is protecting our companies up until 2030. But as of 2030, we enter into another debate. And because also the power sector is going to look very differently. And that is part of the question that I deduct about the accompanying policies. I am always a little bit speechless about, accompanying policies, because we proposed at the time a carbon market, a renewable energy goal, and an energy efficiency goal. And the three were calibrated with one another. Today, we are doing exactly the same. I mean, you cannot reason in terms of a policy instrument in isolation. It also has an impact with other policy parts of the jigsaw. And I think the question on accompanying policies is, for that reason, a little bit of a theoretical question that comes from the textbooks and rather than from the day-to-day practice in policy making. However, the question is there, what are we doing for our energy-intensive activities, the commodities? And for that, we have to get cracking on new technology. And that's why we have an innovation fund. And I'm told about low-carbon steel that is being produced already today. But it's much more expensive because it's a new technology. So we have to get cracking on the technology and make it commercially available. So that is, for me, the accompanying policy, that we get the innovation driven into a low-carbon dimension. And that is where the new ETS that we are now finalizing is going to be much better equipped compared to the version that is currently in place today. And on the question on the energy transition and the nuclear phase out in Germany, well, I don't know, but I think much more important for the debate is the oil price expectation. 5 years ago, it was all about peak oil. Oil would peak $100, $150, $200 per barrel. Today, the expectations are that there is no expectation that the price is going to go higher than 50 euros or dollars per barrel. And so I think these elements plus technology, what is happening in the renewable sector and what is happening in the digital economy is going to impact much more than a decision of one or the other to move out or move in one or the other technology. I think, or one or the other energy source. So I think that technology, the oil price, is going to be a determinant factor much more for the future compared to what we have been seeing in the past. And again, the Market Stability Reserve is well equipped to also cope with this kind of developments if they arrive at a certain point in time.
Thank you. We are already over time, and we have lunch waiting outside. And I would suggest, because people are slowly dissipating out, that we close the formal part of the event now. I take from the event that the ETS still takes center stage in Brussels when discussing about fiscal aspects, and that there are good reasons for that, being a very effective, efficient, and pragmatic tool, and now even offering the potential to maybe at some stage raise own revenues for Brussels. I hope that at some point we might also explore whether Brussels can take a stronger coordinating role also on other fiscal aspects, but that's maybe for another debate. Thank you very much for coming. And